Hi, everybody. It's Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Sunday, May 19th today, and I'm popping on doing a little live video because I want to promote a special event that I'm hosting today at noon Eastern online. I'm going to give you the link to that event here in a little bit and give you all the information that you need to know to connect to this special event. I host every season of the astrological year. I host a series of seasonal speakers that come out and give talks on different topics in the field of astrology. So, for example, basically, when we hit like a new cardinal sign, Aries, we're in spring season right now, started with Aries. Sometime between Aries, Taurus, and Gemini, I usually host 3 to 4 speakers who will give talks about different topics in the field of astrology. Often I try to bring in speakers who are doing something that's very different from what I do, or the kind of curriculum I teach, or the kinds of topics that I typically would host in my own classroom. So give the students a break from just hearing from me and get some other interesting astrological teachers and teachings into the classroom space. So I do that regularly, and you all probably see me advertise that somewhat regularly. And I am really excited because today is actually the final speaker in our guest speaker series. The first 3 happened last month in April, and I had one more that I couldn't get him in the schedule in April because of Easter season. But he's here now today at noon Eastern. I want to tell you a little bit about him and a little bit about the talk, and talk a little bit generally about the topic that he's covering today, because I think it's really interesting and really important. So the guest today at noon Eastern, I put the login information into the chat box on Facebook so that you can access it. You can find it on my Facebook homepage. If you go to nightlightastrology.com and visit the events page, you can also find the login information there. Again, it's at noon Eastern today. It's free. The author is Dr. Michael Ward. Michael Ward is, I'll just give you like a little background on him, because he's actually he's a really interesting person. So Michael Ward is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford. And he wrote this book, which is award-winning and really renowned in the Christian world and the academic world, which is very different in many respects from the astrological world, but there's a really interesting tie-in here. So he wrote this book called Planet Narnia, The 7 Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. You can see it. So he was doing research while he was at Oxford, and what he was trying to do was he was trying to figure out what, if anything, was creating cohesion in each of the 7 books of Narnia allegorically. If you've ever read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I think a lot of people have, or if you've ever seen the film, it's quite clearly a kind of Christian allegory. It's mythical, it's a fantasy story, it's for kids, but The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe also has this central sort of Christ figure, Aslan. And, Aslan ends up having a sort of crucifixion and resurrection, and it's a big part of the story. And quite clearly, people identified the Christian allegory. But then there's 6 other books in the series. You got books like Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair, Horse and His Boy, Magician's Nephew, Last Battle. And all of these other books appear to have something. It appears as though something allegorical is being said or communicated, but it has baffled scholars of C.S. Lewis's work for a very long time. What was the allegorical symbolism behind it? Like how was he? Each book seems to be allegorical, but no one could really figure out why. One of his contemporaries, famously J.R.R. Tolkien, once sort of said, it's just a hodgepodge, it's a mishmash, it's a mashup, and there's no real clear allegorical thread tying them all together. Well, Ward and many other people have seriously doubted that. For example, you've had people who have tried to string together the 7 Chronicles of Narnia in association with the 7 deadly sins of Christianity, as if each book features some kind of allegorical teaching about one of the 7 deadly sins. But it's been theorized for a long time by serious scholars of Lewis's work that there was some meaningful thread tying it all together. And people could not generally figure out what that thread was. What is it that ties all of these 7 Chronicles of Narnia together? And again, clearly there's a suspicion, because Lewis is a Christian, and he's an apologist and a theologian, but also he's a medievalist, right? He's a scholar of medieval literature. So the question becomes, what is it that ties all of these 7 Chronicles of Narnia together allegorically? And when Ward was doing his research, what he found in doing the research, and he's going to present on this today and tell you, all of you, about how he actually discovered this, what he discovered was that Lewis had intentionally embedded each of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia with a kind of Christian allegorical take on the traditional astrological symbolism of the 7 planets. So, for example, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is based on Jove or Jupiter. And he'll explain, why in his presentation, and that's exactly what he explains in his book. Prince Caspian is based on Mars. Voyage of the Dawn Treader is based on the Sun. The Silver Chair is based on the Moon, which actually is very obvious in the title, since silver is the metal of the Moon. So Lewis apparently, he at one point he said something that was really interesting. He said that the planets were, see if I can get this quote actually. The characters of the planets as conceived by medieval astrology seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols. That's what C.S. Lewis actually said about the 7 planets. And then we have so many other correspondences, letters, and essays that he wrote where he talked about the planetary symbolism. And we see many of the foreshadowings of the stories of the Narnia Chronicles and how he often talked about the planets and about different spiritual symbolism related to the planets. So this book is really groundbreaking for a lot of reasons. One, just very simply, it seems to, I after reading it, I was very convinced. This is not like your Ancient Aliens, show where there's a lot of, sort of like potentially sketchy information being presented. This is, those shows are fun to me or whatever, but you know what I'm saying? Like most people do not take them really seriously. This has actually been taken really seriously as a groundbreaking piece of research that pretty much solidly proves that Lewis had embedded each of the 7 Narnia Chronicles with planetary symbolism, and he had done so intentionally, but also secretly. And there's also ways that we see in his previous work that why he spoke of the value of secretly embedding allegorical symbols within texts, which the medievalists did as well. So this is a really, really interesting presentation. And one of the things that was so compelling for me is, of course, I grew up in the Christian church. I was a preacher's kid, and I went to a Baptist college and was a youth minister for a while. And the Narnia Chronicles were dear to me. Like, they were probably one of my favorite books growing up, maybe next to like The Lord of the Rings. And when I read those books as a kid, it always struck me that there was something very, very magical about them. And so, as an adult, now that I am a sort of displaced Christian and yogi, but also an astrologer who still have a lot of appreciation for Christian allegory, Christian symbolism. And I think a lot of people do. In fact, I would say like maybe 50% of the clients that I see year round would describe themselves as sort of spiritual, not religious, maybe somewhat displaced Christians, valuing many Christian teachings, but not really feeling like they have a home in institutional Christianity. A huge amount of the astrological community, I would guess, out there who consumes astrology in the United States anyways, or in Western nations, has some background in Christianity. In fact, throughout the history of, from the Roman Empire all the way through the medieval times and Renaissance and beyond, it was actually very acceptable for Christians, even clergy, to practice astrology. There's always been some pretty fierce debate among Christian theologians about the efficacy of astrology, but it's been used in various ways for a very long time. Medically, sometimes married with herbal medicine or surgery. In the past, it was also used as a way of understanding constitution, psychology, and also predictive elements as well. You can find, for example, in certain places in Europe, you'll still find zodiacal symbolism on the insides of cathedrals and churches. There's even certain bishops or cardinals or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly, that still have their birth charts etched into stone near their tombs. So, and there you can find amazing zodiacal symbolism in some of the artwork in old old Catholic or European, like medieval church sites. So at any rate, the reason that this excited me is I thought, well, here I am growing up a Christian kid who's basically told astrology is like evil, and yet my favorite Christian author of fantasy books is embedding all of his books with a sort of Christian take on the symbolism of the 7 planets. So I think, first of all, that it's remarkable, and one of the reasons that I'm really excited about this talk is because I really want people to recognize that it doesn't really matter which religious path of life you're coming from. As Lewis said, let's read that quote from Lewis one more time. The characters of the planets as conceived by medieval astrology seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols. So one of the reasons that I want to do this is because I think there are so many people out there who come from a Christian background, may have some curiosity in astrology, and they think, I think this might be hands off from my Christian perspective or from some other religious or spiritual perspective. And I think that what Ward does a really good job of doing is not only illustrating the ways in which Lewis used them as spiritual symbols, but as the way that he embedded them into a kind of Christ consciousness that he threaded throughout all of the Narnia Chronicles. So for example, let's do a simple one. I'll just give you a simple taste. I did about a 3-hour presentation on Planet Narnia a few years ago. My favorite of the Narnia Chronicles growing up was the Silver Chair. The Silver Chair was, I don't know why it was my favorite, probably because I was born under the full moon in the 9th house, but the Silver Chair is a book that features, first of all, a heroine rather than a hero. There's a young girl who is the hero of the story, Jill. And in the story, basically what happens is Jill, as usual, they get swept off to Narnia through a magical gateway. The wardrobe in the first one, but there's other gateways that come throughout the Narnia Chronicles. And she's taken to Aslan's country in the very beginning of the story. And Aslan is there and says, okay, you're going to descend down into Narnia. But once you get down there, the air is going to be denser. The air is going to be thick, and you're going to forget. You're going to have a tendency to forget things. He's telling her this because he's about to give her all the instructions that she needs in order to successfully accomplish a mission which she is being sent to Narnia to perform. That mission is to help recover a kidnapped prince. Prince Rilian, who's Caspian's son, who's been kidnapped by if I remember correctly, it's a serpent who also appears as a witch. Now, there's a long backstory with all this. It's really interesting. So at any rate, Jill at the beginning first of all, Aslan draws her near and recites into her ear all of these special coded instructions, and they're enigmatic. They're almost like mantras. And he says, you just have to repeat these over and over and over again. You have to remember what I'm telling you. You have to remember what I'm telling you. And then remember, once you get down there, you're going to start forgetting. So you're going to have to keep repeating these instructions. Okay, so then she goes down to Narnia, and of course she goes on the mission to find from the moon down is called the sublunary sphere. The moon was sort of the threshold or gatekeeper between the upper angelic or heavenly realms and the planetary realm of the earth, which was the densest point of materiality and a place of ignorance and forgetting. Just as yogis tell us, this material world is a place where we tend to forget that we are also spiritual beings, and we get identified with material things. The more that we get identified with material things and forget our spiritual nature and our communion with divinity, the more lost we become, right? So this is a basic planetary teaching about the moon that's been around for thousands of years, that the moon governs over the realm. It sits as the gateway between materiality and spirituality. And for example, if you die and you've been in gross ignorance in the yogic tradition and you're to be reincarnated, you go to the moon first, right? Similarly, if you're to be enlightened, you go past the moon. So at any rate, there's lots of stories like this. But the moon is one of its spiritual values, it's sort of eternal spiritual values that Lewis recognized, was this idea of remembrance. Now, why would the moon represent remembrance? And why a little bit more about that materiality? Well, because the moon is like a dark it's sort of a dark rock, basically, but it reflects the light of the sun. So similarly, materiality on its own, without the light, the animating light of spirit and consciousness, is dead, right? But when we understand the material world as filled, infused with the life breath, so to speak, of the divine, when we understand that it's filled, infused with consciousness, and that there are sentient beings, souls all around us, right? Then the dark rock goes from dark rock to being reflective of its source, which is the sun, the source of the light. So similarly, the moon has long been associated with devotion and remembrance, whether it's the devotion of a mother to their child, right? Or if it's the devotion that you feel to your family or your family lineage. Remembrance and devotion. Those are things that are related to the moon, specifically because of that idea of the moon being dark, a dark rock that can become reflective. And the reflectiveness is recalling an original light. So the moon as a spiritual symbol has always represented for symbolic thinkers for a long time this connection to remembering our source. So Aslan at the beginning, remember, Aslan's the lion, and Aslan, not surprisingly, is represented by the sun. Leo is the lion, and Leo is the home of the sun. So the sun is giving instructions to the young girl who is representative of the moon. She's a heroine, and she's going to go down and have this adventure where she has to remember the original instructions. She has to remember her source. She has to remember Aslan. And the whole journey, the whole book is shaped off from that premise. It's about remembering and forgetting. And when they get all the way down into the underworld and find Prince Brillian, there's a whole thing that happens also about him having forgotten his real nature. And in order to remember it, he has to call on the name of Aslan, which is really, really beautiful teaching, right? So this and so many other pieces of beautiful evidence strewn throughout the silver chair. What is the silver chair? Well, the silver chair is the thing that Brillian's tied to, that is making him forget his true identity. So there's this kind of double nature where the moon can, in traditional astrology, can represent either remembrance and devotion, or it can also represent ignorance, forgetting, sleep, intoxication, and poison even. So, you know, when you look at the silver chair, what you're looking at is a story about remembrance and forgetting, delusion, sleep, and wakefulness. And it's a beautiful story the whole way through, just strewn with lunar symbolism. And once I read it, I was like, it was amazing to me that I read that book so many times as a kid and I loved it so much. And here I am, someone who was born a Cancer sun, you know, sun in the sign of the moon, in the third house, which is traditionally the joy of the moon. And I was born with the full moon in the ninth place, which is the place of religion and spirituality. So it helped me tie together some of the archetypal makeup of my birth chart as well. And then when I also realized that for Lewis, he was using these symbols as ways of illustrating different dimensions of what it means to be a Christian. And I just thought, my God, isn't that is just the most imaginative, beautiful thing ever. And what it did for me was also very healing, because I will be completely honest with you and tell you that a lot of people that I know from my Christian past now think that, you know, I'm going to hell. Do you know what I mean? So, or that people who do astrology, who are interested in the spiritual symbolism of astrology, are off their rockers somehow. So to find, of course, that the stalwart, you know, Christian apologists, like I don't know any Protestant denomination really in the country, for example, I grew up in the Protestant church, who wouldn't, like, you know, probably if they have a bookstore in their church or something like that, they're going to have some C.S. Lewis, you know what I mean? But C.S. Lewis was writing about, he wrote a space trilogy, and he wrote Planet Narnia. He wrote all the Narnia Chronicles strewn with planetary symbolism. So it felt like coming home to me. It felt like finding a way to build a bridge between the esoteric Christian mysticism vis-a-vis Lewis and Narnia, and the path that I'm now walking as an adult, as an astrologer who's also more primarily identified at this point with the path of Bhakti Yoga, but it's the yoga of devotion, of course, right? The yoga of devotion. And one of the prophets who's thought to be an avatar of Krishna in the tradition that I follow, Lord Chaitanya, who came about 500 years ago or so and initiated the public kirtan. So if you've ever seen the Hare Krishnas chanting kirtan in the streets or something like that, that was initiated by a guy named Lord Chaitanya, and he was born under a full moon and an eclipse, and he becomes a symbol of devotion, and he's related to the full moon. And so when I've gone for the past couple of years to India, in Mayapur, the place is specifically related to the moon and lunar symbolism and the connection between the moon and devotion. So when I read this book and I tied together my adult sort of devotional path, like bhakti is all about devotional love of God. It's a lot like Sufis are very similar in some ways. But growing up, that was the part of Christianity that I loved most, was the devotional sort of charismatic love of God. So to find that Lewis had used a symbol that I love so much to talk about devotion in the silver chair was life-changing for me. It was very healing. And of course, this happened, by the way, while Pluto, which is Lord of the underworld and secrets and hidden stuff and purging and healing and stuff like that, Pluto was going over my moon when I first read this book. So at any rate, I wanted to share all of that with you today because some people might look at a talk by a guy like, some doctor from Oxford giving a talk about C.S. Lewis and Christianity and planets and be like, yeah, I'm not a Christian. I've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe once or whatever. But I think that a talk like this is really important because I think that if someone like Dr. Ward is good enough to come out and speak to an audience of astrologers, he's not an astrologer. This is in left field for him, so to speak. You know what I mean? But he's someone who took some major risks academically in putting this out there. And of course, it's been received. You can imagine how it's been received by different people. Some people are really going to think it's interesting. A lot of people in the Christian world are going to think, ooh, astrology, like, does this taint C.S. Lewis, or do you know what I mean? So I think it's really important that we have a good showing of astrological community to support someone who's doing this kind of work, because it's interesting and it tells us new interesting things about Lewis and his imagination. And I think you'll learn some interesting things also about, to me, there's nothing so refreshing as finding really interesting mystical and esoteric takes on the teachings of Jesus or of different religious and spiritual traditions. So I hope that you guys will all come out, check it out. Here's something about the planets in Narnia. That's at noon today, noon Eastern. So if you want to check it out, here's how you can do it. There's a Zoom link on my website. I'm going to copy and paste the link, and I'm putting this on YouTube as well, so I'm going to copy and paste the link onto YouTube. You go to the events page on my website, you'll find a link there. During the talk, we collect donations. They're $15 to $25 suggested donation, but if you can't afford to give that much, you can give whatever you like. You just pitch in a donation, that's fine. If you can't afford to give anything today, that's okay too. We just ask you to, pay it forward, tell someone, share with someone what you learned, or come back next time and pitch in when you can. So I wanted to come and do a special promo today because I'm really trying to generate a good crowd for this talk. The other thing that I want to talk about, just in closing, and in general, is that if you wanted to pick up a copy of the book and read it, I'll just say it again. It's Planet Narnia by Michael Ward. You can find it on Amazon. There's also a BBC documentary that was made called The Narnia Code. Let's say you can't make it today, but you're really interested. You could pick up a copy of the talk if you donate on my website, and I'll email it to you so you can download it and watch it later. But also, if you can't make it live, check out the Amazon version of the BBC documentary Planet Narnia, or the Narnia Code. Because it's about an hour-long documentary that will present some of the same stuff that Dr. Ward will be presenting today. So those are different ways that you could kind of check it out on your own if you can't make it today, but I hope you can. And then what else? So after reading this and finding this out, I was so inspired that I read all of the Narnia Chronicles to my unborn daughter every night. My wife had never heard the Narnia Chronicles, so I read them aloud, literally like to her stomach, where, while my daughter was in the womb. It was really, really amazing to revisit the stories. But once you hear this talk, and if you go and revisit them, let's see if I can get them. So here they are right here, right? This is an old copy of the Chronicles of Narnia, and they're all there. But if you go back and reread these books with this new perspective, you'll also be treated to an incredible piece of literature. It becomes so much more amazing once you have some of these insights, which I have to say, I also really appreciate that Lewis was hidden in the manner that he did it, because, I think, well, his argument, which you'll hear Ward probably say, was that if people's allegorical devices are too obvious within a text, it really kills the experience. So it's very good in some ways that we don't know when we're reading these exactly what the thread is that connecting it all together. It's kind of good we don't know that it's the planets, but now that we do know, and you can read the planetary symbolism, it also changes your relationship with the planets, because there is nothing like seeing, like when you see a film or a movie or read a book, and you know that the author had in mind certain kinds of allegories, myths, symbols. It helps you get to know those symbols in a much deeper way, because symbols live in the imagination, and symbols often are best explored or explained through story. That's why, for example, in India, one of the greatest traditions that sort of distills a lot of the philosophy of the Vedas and the Upanishads are the Puranas. And the Puranas are collections of living stories. So they're actual, it's more like the Puranas are a bit like your serial TV that you get hooked on, right? It's like, these episode after episode, and you're drawn in. Now, the Puranas in India are like that too. They take a lot of really complex, philosophy, and they have a way of putting it right into story form. So similarly, we need that in order to really know these higher spiritual teachings, so to speak. This is also why astrologers in general are in the business of trying to help people understand the way in which their lives are living illustrations of planetary symbolism. Because when we know that, when we can see it, when we have a little bit of a decoder ring, so to speak, then we start understanding the way in which the divine is speaking to us through the stagecraft of our lives, which is a really amazing thing. And that's why I do astrology, for sure. So this is what I've got for you guys, and I hope that you will come and check it out at noon. And that's let's see, should go for about an hour plus 30 minutes of Q&A, he said. So probably an only 90-minute talk, but hopefully you'll come out and join it. All right, thanks everyone, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.